The empty space where his shadow should have been there is a memory Alara returns to on the nights when the darkness becomes too loud to bear. She is 7 years old, standing in her grandmother's kitchen, and the afternoon sunlight is pouring through the window like warm honey across the wooden floor. Her grandmother is humming something old and wordless, stirring a pot that smells of cinnamon and cloves, and for exactly 11 seconds, Alara counted. Even then, the world is completely quiet inside her head. No darkness crawling at the edges of her vision. No writhing, hungry shadows clinging to the walls like living things. Just light and warmth and the smell of something sweet. Then the neighbor's dog walks past the window, and the shadow it drags behind it is not a dog shadow at all. It is enormous and ancient and full of teeth, and it turns its head and looks directly at Alara through the glass with eyes like two dying stars. She screamed so hard she lost her voice for 3 days. Her grandmother held her and rocked her and whispered that she was safe, that it was only a shadow, that shadows cannot hurt anyone. But her grandmother was wrong. Alara has spent the last 26 years learning exactly how wrong she was. The gift, if you could call it that, which Alara absolutely did not, had a name in the old texts that the people who hired her liked to use. They called it the sight of the veil, a rare and extraordinary ability to perceive the dark energy of supernatural beings, the second soul that clung to every immortal creature like a living parasite. Vampires were the worst. Their shadows were dense and furious things, coiling around their bodies in constant motion. Hungry and territorial, and aware in a way that made Alara's stomach turn every single time she was forced into proximity with one. She had learned to control her reactions over the years, to keep her face perfectly neutral while the darkness screamed at her from every corner of a room. She had learned to breathe through it, to focus on the physical world, the grain of a wooden table, the flicker of a candle, the press of her own fingernails into her palm, and use those anchors to keep herself from drowning in the supernatural noise that never, ever stopped. It was exhausting in a way that had no proper word. It was the kind of tired that lived in the bones, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the hollow place behind the eyes where sleep never quite reached. And it was the only life she had ever known. Which was precisely why, when the man called Dorian Vex had come to her with an envelope full of more money than she had earned in 5 years, and a very simple request. She had said yes before she even finished reading the terms. Scout the Vampire King's court gathering, identify his weaknesses, report back, do not engage. The simplicity of it was almost insulting, but the money was real, and Alara's rent was 3 months overdue. And she had long since stopped pretending that she had the luxury of a moral compass when survival was the only item left on her list. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she was just a pair of eyes, nothing more. She told herself that a great many things on the cold, gray morning she pinned her dark hair up, smoothed the borrowed silk of a deep burgundy gown across her body, and stepped into the carriage that would take her to Blackthorn Hall. She had done her research. Every person hired by Dorian Vex eventually did their research on Soren Blackthorn, if only because knowing the shape of the thing you were walking toward felt marginally better than walking blind. King Soren Blackthorn was, by every account she had found, the oldest living vampire in the known world. Not the oldest created, the oldest living. Which was a distinction that apparently mattered a great deal to the kind of people who attended his court gatherings, in gowns that cost more than Alara's entire apartment. He had ruled for over 4 centuries. He had survived 7 documented assassination attempts, 2 supernatural wars, and a political coup so catastrophic it had apparently reshaped the entire hierarchy of the immortal world. His enemies, and there were many, which was precisely why Dorian Vex existed, whispered that he was unkillable. His allies, the few that remained loyal, said nothing at all. Silence, Alara had long ago learned, was always the loudest testimony, and then there was the other thing. The thing that people at the fringes of the supernatural world whispered about with a mixture of ridicule and unease: the strange. persistent rumor that had followed Soren Blackthorn for the last century like a ghost, following its own footsteps. The Vampire King cast no shadow. In a world where the shadows of supernatural beings were the most real and powerful things about them, where the dark energy of an immortal's second soul was considered the source of their strength. Their cruelty, their very identity, the king had none. His court thought it was a curse. His enemies thought it was a weakness. Everyone, from what Alara had gathered, found it quietly hilarious. She had filed the information away with mild interest, and then forgotten about it entirely. She had seen enough supernatural shadows to find the absence of one more relieving than remarkable. She was not prepared for how profoundly, devastatingly right she was. Blackthorn Hall was exactly what its name promised, grand and dark, and cold in the way that only very old buildings could be cold. As if the stone itself had absorbed centuries of secrets and was still digesting them. The great hall where the court gathered was lit by hundreds of candles, their flames reflected in the black marble floors until the room seemed to float between two skies. And the assembled vampires and their various supernatural companions moved through the space in a river of silk and jewels and barely contained menace. Ilara felt the darkness the moment she stepped through the doors. It hit her like a physical wall, thick, roiling, a dozen different supernatural signatures crashing against her sight simultaneously, each one a different texture of wrong. She breathed through her nose, slow and deliberate, and pressed her thumbnail hard against the inside of her wrist and focused on cataloging rather than feeling. There was a vampire near the east wall, whose shadow was so old, and so dense it had developed something that looked disturbingly like a face. There were two others near the bar, whose shadows were intertwined, in a way that suggested they were far more than the strangers they were pretending to be. There was a creature near the fireplace that was not a vampire at all, though it was wearing a very convincing human face. And its shadow was something Ilara had never encountered before, flat and perfectly geometric, and utterly silent, in a way that made the hair on the back of her neck stand at attention. She noted everything, she breathed through all of it. She accepted a glass of something deep red from a passing server, without drinking it, and moved through the room like she belonged there. Which was a skill she had bought with years of practice, and a great deal of personal suffering. And then she saw the empty space where his shadow should have been, and the entire world went quiet. She noticed him before she found his face, noticed the absence of him first, the strange, impossible stillness in the air around a figure standing at the far end of the room. Every supernatural being in the hall was dragging their darkness with them like a physical weight. The shadows clustering and writhing and reaching toward each other the way that supernatural energy always did, hungry and restless, and constantly seeking. But there was a space, a clean and perfect circle of absolute nothing, at the center of the room's far end. No darkness, no writhing energy, no second soul pressing against the edges of reality. Just emptiness, calm. Ilara stopped walking without meaning to. She stood completely still in the middle of the crowded hall and stared at the space, her sight reaching for it the way a blind person reaches for light, instinctively, desperately. Before she even understood why. And then the man standing at the center of that emptiness turned his head, and she found his face. And something inside her chest cracked open like a window being thrown wide in a room that had been sealed for years. He was beautiful in the way that very dangerous things were sometimes beautiful, not designed for admiration, but impossible to look away from regardless. Tall, broad-shouldered, carved from something harder and more patient than ordinary bone. His hair was dark, the kind of dark that had depth to it, layers of shadow even in the candlelight. His face was all strong lines and quiet authority, the face of someone who had long ago stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. He wore black, which was unremarkable in this company, but wore it like a choice rather than a uniform. And he was standing in the middle of his own court, gathering with the particular ease of a man who was completely serenely aware that everyone in the room was either afraid of him or pretending very hard not to be, and found the whole performance mildly interesting at best. His eyes were moving through the crowd, with an attention that looked casual and was absolutely not, and he was holding a glass of something dark with one hand and saying nothing. And the space around him was the most peaceful thing Alara had experienced in 26 years of living inside a world that never stopped screaming at her. She realized, standing there with her untouched glass and her borrowed gown and her pounding heart, that she had started moving toward him before she made any conscious decision to do so. She stopped herself 6 feet away, behind the cover of a cluster of courtiers who were laughing loudly about something. And she stood there, and she breathed, and she tried to understand what her own body was doing, because this was not part of any plan she had made. The emptiness around him was not frightening. That was the thing she couldn't process, the thing that kept short-circuiting her careful, practiced composure. Every supernatural absence she had ever encountered in her years of this work had been the cold, dead emptiness of something that had been destroyed or suppressed, the psychic equivalent of a wound. This was nothing like that. This was rest. This was the feeling of setting down something very heavy after carrying it for so long you had forgotten the weight had a name. She stood in the outermost edge of the space where his shadow should have been, and felt her shoulders drop 2 full inches, and her jaw unclench and the constant grinding pressure behind her eyes ease back for the first time in longer than she could remember. She stood there and hated herself for it and could not move away. She almost missed the toast. A vampire lord near the center of the room, older than most of the court, dripping in jewels and self-importance, and a shadow so bloated with age it had begun pooling on the floor around his feet, raised his glass and made a long, elaborate speech about the honor of the occasion that Alara parsed only in pieces, her attention fractured between the words and the extraordinary quiet of the space 6 feet to her left. The room raised their glasses. And then the vampire lord smiled, wide and knowing and cruel, and added, with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed the cruelty specifically, and of course to our host, who graces us with his presence, his power, and the endlessly fascinating absence of everything else. There was a ripple of laughter through the court, polished and subtle and deeply satisfied with itself. Several vampires exchanged glances loaded with amusement. Someone near the back made a comment too low for Alara to catch that produced a wave of barely suppressed snickering. Alara watched Soren Blackthorn receive this with his glass raised and a faint, unbothered smile on his face, and she thought, very clearly, that every single person laughing in this room was a fool of breathtaking magnitude, because none of them could see what she could see. And what she could see was not a curse or a weakness or a thing to laugh about. What she could see was a king, whose darkness had become so vast and so absolute that it had transcended the visible entirely, and she was standing 6 feet away from it and feeling, for the first time in her adult life, like she could breathe all the way down. She was still processing that when the assassin moved. He came from the left side of the room, dressed as a court attendant, moving fast and with the particular fluid grace of a vampire who had committed to violence and made their peace with it. The blade in his hand was not metal. Alara's sight caught that immediately, caught the bone-white gleam of it, the way it cut through the supernatural energy in the room like a blade through fabric. Something old and precisely crafted, and designed for exactly one purpose. The court had not noticed. The security near the doors had not noticed. The assassin was 3 steps away from Soren Blackthorn's back, and the laughter was still dying down from the toast, and Alara was standing there with her untouched glass and her mission parameters echoing "Do not engage. Do not engage, scout and report," and she opened her mouth anyway. She never made a sound. The floor exploded. There was no other word for it that came close to the reality. The black marble directly beneath the assassin's feet cracked apart from below, and from the fractures rose something that should not have existed. Something that Alara's sight perceived as a living darkness of almost incomprehensible density, not the writhing, hungry shadows she saw on every other supernatural creature in the room, but something different, something older and more deliberate, a darkness that moved with intention and intelligence and She would think later in the small hours of the night, when she kept reliving it, something that moved with what she could only describe as fury. It erupted from the floor in a wave, and it hit the assassin like a physical force, taking him completely off his feet, slamming him into the marble 6 feet away, with a sound like a thunderclap in a closed room. The bone blade skittered across the floor and shattered against a pillar. The assassin did not get up. The court erupted screams and backward movement, and the crash of glasses, the sudden chaotic reshuffling of bodies seeking distance from the thing that had just happened. And in the center of all of it, Soren Blackthorne stood completely still, completely unhurried, his glass still in his hand and not a drop spilled. His expression not having changed in any measurable way. The darkness that had erupted from the floor was already retreating, pulling back beneath the marble like a tide going out, leaving behind nothing, no crack, no mark. No evidence that it had ever existed. Just the clean, empty space around him, as calm as it had ever been. And then he turned and he looked directly at Alara, not at the chaos, not at the fallen assassin. Not at the court, scrambling to reassemble its dignity around him. He looked at her, across the width of the disrupted room, through the moving bodies and the drifting candle smoke and the noise. With the certainty of someone who had known exactly where she was standing for considerably longer than she was comfortable thinking about. His eyes were dark and deep and extraordinarily calm, and for a moment neither of them moved at all, the room churning around them like water around two fixed stones. And Alara felt the quiet of his empty space reach her from 20 feet away, like a hand extended in a dark room. Then he smiled. It was slow and it was devastating, and it was the kind of smile that had absolutely nothing to do with reassurance and everything to do with recognition. He said something to the guard at his shoulder without breaking eye contact, and the guard moved, and the crowd parted, not dramatically, not with any great announcement, just the natural gravitational parting that happened when Soren Blackthorne moved through a room, and he walked toward her. Every step was unhurried and inevitable, and Alara stood her ground through what she could only describe as a profound act of personal will. Her heart doing something complicated and loud against her ribs. Her sight flooding her with the extraordinary wrongness of a man-shaped void, moving through a room full of screaming supernatural darkness. The silence of him more arresting than any amount of noise could ever have been. He stopped close, closer than strangers stood. Close enough that she could see the precise shade of his eyes, which were not quite black and not quite brown but something deeper than either. Something that held the same quality of his absent shadow, vast and quiet and incomprehensibly old. Close enough that the edge of the quiet reached her fully, and her entire nervous system released a breath it had been holding for 26 years. He looked at her face with the focused, careful attention of someone reading something they had been searching for across a very long time. And then he said, his voice low and unhurried and entirely private in the noise of the disrupted court around them, "You can see it, can't you?" It was not a question. His head tilted very slightly. "My shadow." He let the words land, watching her face the way a cartographer watches a map being drawn, cataloging every micro-expression she couldn't quite suppress. "You stood in the edge of it for 4 minutes before you made yourself stop moving forward. You were the only person in this room whose face changed when Aldrich made his toast. And when the darkness moved," he said, and something shifted in his eyes, something that was layered and careful and underneath all of it, devastatingly tired. "You looked at it like you recognized it." He studied her for one more moment, and she could not speak, could not arrange a single one of her carefully prepared deflections into any functional order. Could only stand there in the borrowed gown with her untouched glass and her cracked-open chest, and her sight pressing the extraordinary quiet of him against every exhausted nerve she had. Then he said very quietly, "You're the first one in 400 years. Alara looked at him, this ancient, impossible, terrifyingly perceptive king, whose darkness could throw an assassin across a room without lifting a hand, and whose shadow was somehow the most peaceful thing she had ever experienced. She looked at him and understood with absolute bone-deep clarity that every single thing about this moment was outside the boundaries of the mission she had agreed to, outside the parameters of safe, outside the neat and manageable categories she had spent her entire adult life constructing around herself to keep the darkness at bay. She understood all of that. She opened her mouth to say something professional and measured and distancing. What came out was the truth, quiet and helpless and entirely against her will. "What are you?" she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper, and the question was not an accusation or a strategy. It was the sound of someone who had just seen something they had stopped believing existed. Something that, against every reasonable objection her survival instincts were currently raising, felt like the beginning of an answer she had been asking for her entire life. His smile changed. Something moved through his eyes that she couldn't name, deep and careful, and carrying the weight of 4 centuries she couldn't fathom. He reached out slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who understood that the gesture could easily be refused, and had decided to offer it regardless. And he took the untouched glass from her hand. His fingers brushed hers in the exchange, just barely, just the tips, just a breath of contact, and the quiet of him flooded through the touch like light through a crack. And Alara's whole body went still in a way it had never been still in her entire life. He set the glass on a nearby surface, without looking away from her, and said, soft and certain, and with the patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time and had just conclusively run out of it, "Come with me. There are things you need to understand about what you saw tonight." He paused. His eyes held hers, and the room and the noise and the court and Dorian Vex's money, and every sensible reason to refuse, were all exactly as real and present as they had been 30 seconds ago. "And there are things I need to understand about you." It was only later, much later, in the cold and dark of the room they gave her in Blackthorn Hall. Lying awake with the quiet of his absent shadow still echoing in her bones like music heard through a wall, that Alara would remember what she had found in her coat pocket when she finally sat down. A folded piece of paper, thick and cream-colored, with a wax seal she recognized immediately. Not Dorian Vex's seal, a different one entirely. One she had seen only in the old texts, in the historical records she had combed through in her research. In a footnote about the 7 assassination attempts that Soren Blackthorn had survived across 4 centuries. The seal of the first attempt, the one that had happened 402 years ago, long before she was born, long before her grandmother's grandmother was born. The one that had failed like all the others, for reasons the records described only as impossible, unknown, defying any rational explanation. She broke the seal with fingers that were not entirely steady, and unfolded the paper, and read 3 lines in handwriting she had never seen before and recognized with every cell of her body regardless, the same way you recognize a voice you heard in a dream but cannot place in waking. 3 lines that made the quiet in her bones go ice cold and electric all at once. 3 lines that reframed every single thing that had happened tonight into a shape she was not prepared for. The note said simply, without greeting or signature, as if continuing a conversation rather than beginning one, "You have been here before. You always find me. This time I intend to keep you."